They didn't get lost all at once. They disappeared slowly. In 1848, a wagon train heading west made a decision that would later be described as a mistake. At the time, it was presented as a calculated risk, a shortcut, a way to save weeks of travel, a chance to reach California faster than the thousands of others moving across the continent. This group did not set out to become a mystery. They were not reckless. They were not inexperienced. They were families, laborers, former soldiers, farmers, and guides, moving during one of the most aggressive periods of westward expansion in American history. Their journey was documented, their departure recorded. Their route, at least initially, was known, and then they left it. The event would later be remembered as the fate of the lost wagon train of 1848, a story most people encounter as a footnote, a cautionary tale about bad navigation and harsh terrain, an example of how unforgiving the West could be. According to the accepted historical version, the group abandoned an established trail and entered what is now known as Death Valley. They underestimated the environment, suffered extreme hardship, and paid for it with lives. But most historians say eventually escaped. It is framed as survival. What that framing hides is how close the group came to something else entirely. To understand what actually happened, it's necessary to return to the conditions of 1848, before the mistake was labeled one. This was not a time of accurate maps. Large portions of the western United States were still represented by guesswork, second-hand accounts, and optimistic assumptions. Trails were often defined by usage rather than certainty. A route existed because enough people had survived it, not because it was safe. Information traveled slower than people did. Decisions were made based on rumors picked up weeks earlier, advice given by travelers who had never crossed the terrain themselves, and hand-drawn sketches passed from group to group. Shortcuts were tempting. Every mile avoided meant less food consumed, fewer animals exhausted, and a better chance of arriving before winter or competition closed in. In 1848, speed was not a luxury. It was survival. The wagon train that would later be labeled lost began like many others. Supplies were calculated based on known distances. Wagons were loaded with food, tools, clothing, and trade goods. Livestock was selected for endurance, not speed. Nothing about the departure suggests recklessness. At some point during the journey, the group encountered reports of an alternative route, a path that promised to bypass long detours and difficult terrain ahead. The details were vague, but the idea was appealing enough to divide opinion within the group. Contemporary accounts confirm there were disagreements. Some warned against leaving the established trail. Others argued that the existing route was already proving slower and more difficult than expected. Time was being lost. Supplies were being consumed faster than planned. Eventually, a decision was made. The wagon train left the known route and entered terrain that few Americans at the time truly understood. This region would later earn the name Death Valley, but in 1848, it was simply unmapped land, a vast basin surrounded by mountain ranges, filled with salt flats, dry lake beds, and extreme temperature shifts that could not be predicted without experience. The first days after the turn did not immediately signal disaster. Progress continued, though slower than expected. Wagons creaked under strain. Animals showed early signs of fatigue. The terrain resisted movement in ways the group had not anticipated. As days passed, those small difficulties compounded. Water sources were farther apart than assumed. Trails faded into nothing. The ground shifted between hard salt crusts and loose sand that swallowed wheels and hose alike. Each delay forced the group to stop, and every stop consumed food, water, and energy they could not replace. Animals began to fail. Oxen collapsed under the heat. Horses weakened. Wagons were lightened, then abandoned entirely. What could not be carried was left behind, scattered across the desert without markers or records. The group slowed to a crawl. This is the stage most summaries refer to as the hardship, but the original accounts describe something more disorienting. They describe uncertainty. Distances stopped making sense. A stretch that should have taken hours consumed entire days. Landmarks appeared closer than they were. Routes that seemed passable ended abruptly, forcing backtracking that wasted precious time and strength. Some journals mentioned days where the group believed they were nearing the edge of the basin, only to realize they were still deep inside it. Orientation began to fail. As supplies dwindled, decisions became reactive rather than planned. Fires were fueled by dismantled wagons. Food was rationed to levels that bordered on starvation. Arguments broke out over direction, pace, and leadership. Eventually, the group fractured, not dramatically, not all at once. Small clusters broke off, convinced they could find a way out faster on foot or by taking different paths. Others stayed with the wagons, hoping persistence would carry them through. This fragmentation is crucial because it marks the point where the wagon train stopped functioning as a single group. From that moment on, survival became individual. Later histories tend to compress this period, moving quickly to the eventual escape. But the primary accounts linger here, describing days of exhaustion, confusion, and loss that do not resolve cleanly. People disappear from a narrative without explanation. Names mentioned earlier are never mentioned again. Entire family units vanish between entries. When the survivors finally reached safer terrain, they did not arrive together. They arrived in pieces, some staggered out weeks apart. Some arrived with stories that did not match others. Some accounts describe losses that never appear in official tally. Others mention companions who were simply left behind, too weak to continue, their fate assumed rather than witnessed. This is the context in which the lost wagon train of 1848 should be understood, not as a single wrong turn, but as a slow collapse that unfolded over weeks in a place that offered no margin for error. Only after reaching safety did the story begin to solidify. Only then did it become survivable. Only then did the record start to smooth its edges. And this is where the official version truly begins. The way this story is usually told is straightforward. In most historical accounts, the fate of the lost wagon train of 1848 is framed as a severe but ultimately survivable error. A group of pioneers misled by incomplete information and driven by the pressures of westward expansion made a poor navigational decision and paid for it in suffering. According to this version, the wagon train entered what is now known as Death Valley with limited supplies and little understanding of the terrain. The environment proved harsher than anticipated. Extreme heat, lack of water, and difficult ground slowed progress and exhausted both people and animals. But the group did not vanish. Most summaries emphasize that the majority of travelers eventually escaped the valley. While some lives were lost and property was abandoned, historians generally agree that the wagon train avoided total destruction. The incident is presented as a lesson in the dangers of shortcuts and the unforgiving nature of the western desert. In this telling, the story has a clear arc. A risky decision leads to hardship. Hardship forces adaptation. Adaptation leads to survival. This framing places the event firmly within the broader narrative of American westward movement. It becomes one example among many, illustrating how perseverance and resilience allowed settlers to overcome even the most extreme conditions. The official version highlights the survivors. It notes that those who made it out went on to reach California or nearby settlement. Some resumed their journeys. Others settled where they could. Their accounts, written or recalled later, describe intense suffering but also determination and cooperation. According to these records, the group adjusted to its circumstances. Wagons were abandoned to lighten load. Supplies were rationed. Travel was reorganized. When movement by wagon became impossible, individuals continued on foot. Losses occurred, but they are often described as unavoidable consequences of the environment rather than a result of mismanagement or internal collapse. The desert, in this narrative, is the primary antagonist. The land is portrayed as vast, empty, and hostile. Temperatures are blamed for disorientation, dehydration for poor judgment, distance for delays. Human error exists, but it is softened by the scale of the challenge. This interpretation allows the story to remain impersonal. The valley was deadly. The decision was flawed. but survival was still possible. Many retellings focus on the moment the survivors finally reached the edge of the basin, the relief of finding water, the sight of vegetation after weeks of barren land, the physical collapse that followed once safety was reached. In these accounts, rescue is not dramatic. There are no last-minute interventions or heroic reversal. Instead, the story resolves quietly, with those who survived simply continuing on, carrying the memory of the ordeal with them. Over time, the event becomes a cautionary tale rather than catastrophe. It is cited in discussions of Western migration as an example of why established routes mattered, why reliable maps were essential, why impatience could be fatal. Importantly, this version does not dwell on numbers. Exact death tolls are rarely specified. Losses are acknowledged, but not detailed. Phrases like several members or a portion of the group are used in place of names or counts. The emphasis remains on the fact that most survived. The story's conclusion, as it is commonly presented, reinforces a sense of closure. The wagon train made it out. The mistake was paid for. The West remained difficult, but conquerable. This framing aligns neatly with the broader historical record of the era. Westward expansion was dangerous, but it worked. Tragedies occurred, but they did not derail the movement as a whole. The lost wagon train of 1848, in this context, becomes a manageable story, a warning but not a rupture, a failure but not a disappearance. And because of that, it rarely invites deeper examination. The version preserved in textbooks and summaries appears complete. There is no unresolved mystery, no unanswered question demanding attention. Just a group that made a wrong choice, endured the consequences, and survived to tell the tale. The accepted version of the lost wagon train of 1848 works because it feels complete. A mistake was made. Hardship followed. Most survived. It is a story that ends where it needs to end. But when the original accounts are placed side by side, that sense of completion begins to weaken, not because of a single contradiction, but because of many small ones. The first problem appears in the timeline. Survivors describe leaving the valley at different points, sometimes weeks apart. Yet later summaries compress these departures into a narrow window, as if the group exited almost together. Distances reported by those on foot do not align with the terrain crossed in the time described. Some accounts suggest movement that would have been physically impossible under the conditions they described. These inconsistencies are usually attributed to exhaustion and faulty memory. That explanation is reasonable, but it does not explain why later retellings rely on the most optimistic estimates while quietly discarding the other. The second issue lies in the numbers. Most historical summaries state that the majority survived, but few specify how many that actually was. Early records list individuals who never reappear. Names mentioned during the journey vanish from a narrative without explanation. Entire families are referenced early on and then never mentioned again. There are no burial record, no recovered remains, no map locations of death. Absence becomes the explanation. Another detail often minimized is fragmentation. The official version implies a group that endured together and adapted collectively. The primary sources suggest something different. They describe repeated splintering, small parties leaving in different directions, individuals choosing to walk alone rather than stay with the wagon. This matters because once the group fragmented, survival stopped being shared. Those who escaped could only account for themselves and those immediately around them. Anyone who fell behind or chose another route simply disappeared from record. Later, when the story was told, survival could be reported confidently while loss remained vague. There is also the issue of duration. Some survivors describe being trapped in the valley far longer than others recall. If both accounts are accurate, then the experience was not uniform. Some endured conditions that others never faced. Some may have crossed thresholds that the official narrative does not acknowledge. Yet the story treats the group as a single experience with a single outcome. Wasn't. Perhaps the most telling omission is the lack of follow-up. There was no formal reconstruction of the route, no attempt to precisely document where people were lost, no effort to reconcile conflicting testimonies into a definitive account. The story was accepted, summarized, and moved on from. That silence is often explained by the time period. Limited resources, poor record-keeping, competing priorities, all true, but it also served a purpose. A story of near-total failure would have carried consequences. In 1848, westward migration depended on confidence, on the belief that hardship could be endured and mistakes survived, a narrative that suggested an entire wagon train had nearly been erased by the land itself would have challenged that belief. So the version that endured was the one that reassured. A cautionary tale, not a collapse. A mistake, not a reckoning. None of this proves deliberate deception. It doesn't require it. Memory softens trauma. Survivors emphasize escape rather than those left behind. Later historians rely on the accounts that survived, not the ones that never made out. Over time, what remains feels complete enough. But completeness is not the same as accuracy. What the records actually show is a group that crossed into an environment it did not understand, lost cohesion under pressure, and fractured in ways that made full accounting impossible. Some survived. Some certainly did not. And how close the event came to total annihilation may never be known. Not because the truth is hidden, but because it was never fully recovered. Death Valley did not leave witnesses for everything it took. And history, faced with gaps it could not fill, chose a version that allowed the story to end. Quietly. If you found this investigation compelling, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It helps keep stories like this from being forgotten.